In this video, we'll look at the physiology of nociceptive pain by looking at the main pain fibers, as well as looking at the processes in which pain signals are sent to the brain, and thus how we actually feel and perceive pain. And towards the end, we'll also briefly look at the gate control theory. So, when we talk about pain, obviously the definition of pain is usually an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience that are associated with actual or potential tissue damage. And usually pain in nursing can be quite subjective. And if you look at the different types of pains, you've got neuropathic pain, nociceptive pain, etc. However, in this video, we'll focus on nociceptive pain. Now, in order to understand pain, obviously, you'll need to start from understanding the noxious stimuli or the noxious stimulus. So obviously there needs to be some sort of mechanical force that would need to cause tissue injury or tissue damage. And as soon as there's a mechanical force that triggers that or that affects or that starts the pain, you've got two main pain fibers that come into play, and those are A delta fibers and C fibers. So if you look at A delta fibers, they're myelinated, meaning that they're really quick, they're fast, so the pain signals are able to be transmitted at a very fast rate, and so they're very sharp, localized pain. Whereas with C fibers, they're represented as dull pain because those fibers are unmyelinated, meaning that the transmission of the pain signals will be quite slow and delayed. So a good example of C fiber triggered pain would be things like stomach ache, where you know that the pain is coming from your stomach area, however, you don't know whether it's actually where it exactly is coming from. So the difference between A delta fiber and C fiber is that one's myelinated and the other's unmyelinated, one's sharp, localized, whereas the other's dull and unlocalized. So having understood the two different types of pain fibers, those will eventually trigger what we call action potential. Now, for those of you who've already done A&P, you would have learned all about action potential, how the stimulus will need to exceed the threshold. And as soon as it exceeds this threshold, you've got your action potential being triggered and propagating. And so with the pain pathway, what you need to understand is that it's a 3-neuron system. It's a 3-neuron pathway, meaning that there are 3 neurons taking part in this whole transmission of pain. So as soon as there's the noxious stimuli, the pain fibers are stimulated, action potentials triggered, and the action potentials transmitted via the first order neuron, and it enters the spinal cord dorsally, so through the back of the spinal cord. It passes the dorsal root ganglion and reaches the spine and enters the spinal cord. Now, at the end of the axon terminal of the first neuron, we've got a neurotransmitter called substance P that's released to the second neuron. So basically, your first neuron is communicating with the second neuron through this neurotransmitter to send the signal. And we call that synapse. So the first neuron synapses with the second neuron, and the second neuron crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord and sends the pain signal right up to the thalamus. And at the thalamus, you've got your second neuron that synapses with the third neuron. And the third neuron, once it receives that pain signal, sends the signal to the somatosensory cortex. So that's basically the whole process of how the brain perceives pain. Now, there's obviously what we call descending modulation pathway, which obviously talks about the endogenous opioids, but I will talk about this in the last slide. So let's just quickly go through this again, looking at another diagram over here. So firstly, obviously you need to have some sort of injury that would damage either the tissue or the cells. And this is usually through the noxious stimuli, either A delta fibers or C fibers. And in this diagram, as you can see, it's an injury to the foot, to the left foot. And so the action potential's triggered and the pain signals is quickly sent into the spinal cord through the first neuron, and there's a release of substance P at the end of the first neuron. And so the first neuron communicates with the second neuron, basically its synapses, and decussates, so meaning decussate meaning crossing over to the other side. And then at this point, the second neuron is transmitting the pain signal up to the thalamus. So it passes the brainstem, the midpons, the reticular formation until it reaches the thalamus. And at the thalamus, like I said, the second neuron synapses with the third neuron and sends the pain signal to the somatosensory cortex. And that's how we perceive pain. And in this process, notice how the limbic system is also stimulated. Now, the limbic system regulates our emotions, and so you would have experienced where when you've got excessive instant pain, it all of a sudden makes you really angry. It either makes you angry or makes you really sad and you cry and you're in tears. All of those have to do with your emotions, and that's because the pain signal actually stimulates the limbic system as well as the somatosensory cortex. Hopefully this summarizes the pain pathway for you, and it sort of explains how we perceive pain. Now, why do we need to understand and learn how pain is perceived, or the mechanism, the physiology behind pain? It's so that you can understand the mechanism of action of the pain medications. The pain medications will be dealt with in another video by Dr. Matt. But basically, it's important to understand this whole process so that you can understand the pharmacology, the mechanism of action of different analgesics. Now let's move on to this concept of gate control theory. So when we look at pain, we have this theory called gate control theory, which basically means that we have this inherent system in our body that will control and that will mitigate the level of pain that we are experiencing. Now, basically, this has to do with the modulation process in the pain pathway, which involves what we call interneuron. Now, if you look at the diagram, and if you look at the zoom in square right in the middle of the diagram, you'll notice that there's an enlargement of the first neuron and the second neuron, and in between there's this gray short neuron called inhibitory neuron, or we call it an interneuron. And what it's saying is that this interneuron releases a neurotransmitter called enkephalin or endorphins, and these are basically our natural painkillers, our natural opioids, our natural analgesics, which will mitigate pain. Now, think of it this way. So I've already explained that when the pains When the pain signal is being transmitted, we've got neurotransmitters such as substance P that's released. Now think of the interneuron releasing endorphins as some sort of competition. So there's a competition going on between the neurotransmitters, so between substance P and endorphins or enkephalins. And depending on who wins over, you'll either feel the pain extensively or you'll sort of have this, reduced perception of pain. Now, to put this into perspective, I'll give you an example. So let's say you've hit your leg against something really hard, and obviously you're feeling the instant, sharp, dull pain, excruciating pain. And let's say instantly you're rubbing your leg, trying to mitigate that pain. And you'll notice that the pain actually does subside, and that's because the touch signal that you're sending through is actually competing with the pain signals, and the rubbing action delivers the signal through the interneuron, and that interneuron is releasing the endogenous endorphins. Now, why is it important to understand the gate control theory? Because it suggests that there can be many other alternatives to pain medications, because pain can not only be mitigated and subsided by use of pharmacological interventions, but it can also be mitigated by, let's say, massages or heat packs, cold packs, etc. So it's quite important to understand that the gate control theory does suggest possibilities for non-pharmacological interventions when it comes to mitigating pain.